You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa. Good day, Sacred Sofa listeners. We hope you are soaking in all that the summer has to offer. We are currently airing pilot episodes we taped before launching The Sacred Sofa.
This week, we start a new mini-series on theological tensions we hold about faith and our ideas around God. This episode focuses in on all the ways we experience relational tensions, be that with God, our faith, ourselves, or with others. We hope you enjoy.
I had to start with this quote from Harrison Scott Key. I've just discovered this author. He cracks me up, funny guy. But he says this: I believe the Bible is a comic novel and the oddest and most accurate accounting of human psychology ever assembled. And I love that little line because I think it really sums up for us how the two of us are going to dialogue, because Scripture, the Bible, is a lot of things to different people, but I love that idea of it as an exploration of human psychology. And so, we've talked about this a lot, Grace, but the idea that theology and therapy are sort of separate things, there's just so much crossover between the two. And so it's so exciting for me every time you and I chat. So let me give a quick overview of what I did on the opening Sunday, and then we can dive in. So I talked about the Garden of Eden story, and there's an odd one, if there ever was. This mythical telling of the human condition, you could say, full of talking snakes and angels with fiery swords. But the lesson we learned from it is that the human condition is all about tensions, primarily three: the tensions we experience between ourselves and God, the tensions we experience with ourselves, and the tensions we experience through our relationships with other people. So that was sort of the overview. And then I dove into a few areas, a little mini exploration with each of those. But that to me is what the story of the Garden of Eden and humanity's exile from it really showcases for us, is that we're stuck in these tensions with God, with ourselves, with others. So that was sort of a brief overview.
Yes, absolutely. I've been reading that quote along with you by Harrison Scott Key, and I'm intrigued by the quote. I'm intrigued by his very clear and direct thoughts about the Bible in terms of human psychology. And largely, I would agree. Psychotherapy is actually translated as therapy for the soul, healing of the soul. And to go to this incredible writing of Hebrew scriptures to glean some of those nuggets, gold nuggets, I think is really, really going to be interesting as we journey together. And what a place to begin with the Hebrew creation story.
Right.
And so absolutely, I'm excited to dive in a little further with you. I also appreciate this concept around the tensions between us and God, us and ourselves, us in our relationships. I mean, society gives us so many mixed messages in terms of struggle and resilience. Films and movies show the struggle quickly resolved in an hour or an episode or series. But most of society also wants us to avoid pain and tension. We want to get through it fast, which in itself brings a sort of tension. Why is my suffering or hard circumstance going on so long? So there's a lot here that we can unpack in terms of those tensions.
Yeah, I had no idea. Therapy of the soul. That's very interesting stuff.
Healing of the soul.
Yeah. Yeah. And, there's so many aspects to Scripture, the Bible. I love, though, that on a psychological level, it really is a mirror to us. It holds up a mirror. Here is who you are, humanity, and what you're dealing with. And so it has a tremendous way of sort of shining a light into the area of human struggle. So, yeah, that's our whole thing here, Grace, we're going to be diving into for the foreseeable future. But maybe I'll jump in. One of the first things we learned from this Hebrew creation story, they make their mistake in the garden, And a lot of that is driven out of this question of whether they can trust God. And God sets up some boundaries in the story, and whether or not can God be trusted? Is God trying to keep us from living our best life now? Is God trying to keep us from experiencing something greater? And so at the heart of the story is this issue: can God be trusted? There's other elements there as well, but that seems pretty primal and key for me. I'm curious, in your work with clients or otherwise, is that something that's often named or something that comes up?
Absolutely. Quite a bit of the work I do are folks who are struggling with their faith and spirituality in connection with difficulties in their life, including their relationship with God. And can God be trusted is often a question, whether it's stated that succinctly, maybe
Right.
not so, but that's the underlying worry, wonder, and even doubt, which creates tension because many of us who are raised in faith and spirituality, doubt in itself would have been defined in some ways as a sin. And so inviting places of questioning and doubt is often a lot of work I do. I find it interesting in the story of Adam and Eve, how doubt and mistrust only entered when an external force actually introduced the idea that God was holding something back.
Right.
You know, prior to this point, before the crafty snake, I love that word, crafty, Adam and Eve were living their best life, you know, doing what they were called to do in terms of caring for the garden, for each other, and creation. And this external force plants a little seed of discontent, a wondering, a doubt. And until then, they had everything they actually needed. And this is actually an area that I work with in my psychotherapy practice, that inner critical voice, that negative self-talk often begins externally and then over time becomes internalized as our own voice. And I find that's very intriguing also with Adam and Eve.
That's some good stuff. That'll preach there, Grace. I mean, and that's what I love about these stories is there's so much actually you can mine from them. And the external voice, which we'd often call what? Culture, maybe cultures, societal pressures. Yeah.
Many external voices, media, the way we are socialized as people, messages, covert and overt regarding relationships. It goes on, and I'll speak to some of that as we go into some of these tensions.
Yeah, it just reminds me of almost every time I go to Costco, Grace, that I discover things I didn't know I needed or wanted. Yes. But then I'm like, wow, how did I ever live life without that giant pepper shaker? I don't know, you know, every time I'm there, there's something, but the external pressure, that is fascinating, and how that serves as a voice, not just an influence, but a sort of voice tempting us away from ourselves. There's also, I think, in the story, it ends, of course, with them being exiled from this idyllic paradise, Eden. And I think there's something larger going on there too. We're told in the story that beforehand they walk and talk with God freely, but now at the end of the story, humanity's relationship with God is almost feels like a distance. They've been exiled. There's this gulf between God and ourselves. And I can't help, I mean, even in my own life, think that sometimes, my goodness, it would be great to hear more directly from God. But we live with this, I don't know, this gulf. Can God still be experienced today, heard from today? Does that ever creep up in your work at all?
I make that connection often with community. In Hebrew, it talks about God speaks in diverse ways and through the prophets. Like throughout the Hebrew scriptures, there's different points where God spoke directly, indirectly. And often I weave that into the voice of community, safe community especially. It's like, what is God saying to you in this moment? What do you hear that still small voice saying to you as you're walking in nature? I invite a mindfulness and awareness of looking beyond ourselves. And I think that is often very comforting to clients and folks that I work with to start to release some of this rigidity about how God can show up in the different ways in our lives. So much of our life, Brad, is about mystery, things that we can't tangibly touch on at all the time. I think of love. Love, that concept can sometimes be tangible, but yet is mostly mystical and intangible. I got to share a little secret pleasure that I have, a guilty pleasure that I have. I watched this series called Married at First Sight. Have you seen that
No,
one?
I haven't.
So it's an 8-week experiment. They will use the word experiment. And so these folks are looking for a lifelong partner. And so they'll send in their profile information, and they're partnered with 3 experts. One is actually a pastor, one is a social worker, and then one is a sex educator. And they match these people on paper. So these are things that people said, and presumably we're hoping everyone's being honest in their self-assessment. But it's fascinating, over the 8 weeks, what matched seemingly perfectly on paper somehow mystically doesn't always match in terms of reality. So that says to me, who watches with this psychoanalytical eye along with, is there are just certain things that cannot be defined when we talk about connection, safe people, love, relationship. And to me, that's a seamless experience when I think about how God shows up. There are certain things that you can absolutely have less doubt about, but then there's just so much mystery on how God views us, sees us, and loves us.
And that ties in with the book club that I'm hosting this month at Nexus. Dale Allison's book, Encountering Mystery. What this book is trying to do is normalize the mysterious nature of divine or religious encounters. And it's been a fascinating exploration for me, and challenging some of my, you can get kind of stuck in your ways. Here's how the world works. And it's really shaken me that way. So I appreciate that. And again, I think, the end of the story of Eden results in humanity outside, exiled in a certain sense from God. But of course, the rest of Scripture is God interacting with humanity in various different ways. And so I think that's encouraging and a good note for us to remind people of mystery. You almost have me. I want to watch that show now there, Grace. That sounds intriguing to me.
We can text each other and be like, oh my goodness, what's happening right now?
What's happening? Yes. Oh, I can be guilty of reality TV pleasures sometimes, but yeah.
I'm absolutely fascinated on how humanity walks in the world, which, continues to inspire the work that I do for sure.
Absolutely. Now so there's that. And we're going to, the next month at Nexus is going to be exploring primarily our tensions with God. But then later on, we're going to get into our tensions with ourselves. And I love the Garden of Eden story, Adam and Eve, because it highlights so many things. I mean, primarily, we've already mentioned, the snake tempts them towards this thing. And I'm reminded, as a psychological account of humanity, it reminds me of how often we're attracted to things that can potentially harm us. Things look good, but they're actually bad for us. And of course, things like addictions come to mind for me, or how easily as humans we can be deceived. Or how we can experience shame within ourselves. And this was one of the funny things I talked about, in the sermon, is that I think it's not entirely unique to humans. I've seen my dog look like it's kind of ashamed of itself, but we sort of carry this burden of walking around going, am I living into who I'm supposed to be? Am I living into my true self? Something that I'm not convinced the animal kingdom shares with us. But, this story brings all of those tensions we feel in ourselves to the forefront in a creative way. And I'm sure a lot of your work is dealing with exactly that.
Absolutely. Again, fascinated by our tendency to repeat patterns, even when the result ends in pain, hurt. There's this often tension about living in the potential of what could be rather than the reality of what is. I mean, pick a pop song. Pick up song that you've heard on the radio. My driving to work on 91.5 The Beat and, pop song. And even this morning coming in is a song about bad habits. And she talks about, going back to the ex, she knows it's not going to work, but there she is again. And
right.
I mean, if you actually listen to some of the lyrics of the things we listen to, it's the pattern of the repeated pattern of going back to something we know isn't good for us. And, whether it's through film or through various forms of the media, that message over time becomes insidious. And I think that's another one of those external voices that we internalize and then start to walk in this belief that, if I just keep trying, it's going to be okay. And that is not the truth in many accounts.
Yeah, because it means we haven't unpacked that propensity, right? So, just the try harder mentality often doesn't get, underneath our workings as humans and address why is it that we want to keep returning to the ex or that vice that, we keep struggling with. And so much of psychotherapy deals with that. And, I'm hoping to get into later on in the fall, specifically addictions and human behavior around why we often fall for the same things over and over again. I'm so excited to hear you weigh in on those things, because I think a lot of times theology has a way of highlighting the problem, but not necessarily, and here's some specific ways to maybe address that.
Who doesn't want the 5 steps to ...
Yeah, right. We all do.
If only scripture were marketed in such a clear and concise way. But you did speak to something a bit earlier, which we'll unpack a bit deeper in our series, is shame. Shame is a huge motivator that keeps folks in that pattern of broken relationship with self and others. Shame is this belief that is something wrong or broken in us. It highlights an issue with the self versus the situation where we've stepped outside of our values or a societal value. And shame is this emotion that just spirals you down into a place that is ultimately non-productive. And we'll talk about how to separate shame versus healthy guilt.
Interesting. And can you repeat that line? Because I was intrigued there. Something about differentiating between the self and the situation. Is that what you said?
Yes. Shame is the focus on something believed to be wrong or broken with the self. Whereas healthy guilt is going to highlight that it's not about the self, it's about the situation where you've stepped outside of your value. And I'll talk a bit more about shame versus healthy guilt. And I also add something called misplaced guilt. Those are key elements to understand, because shame is non-productive, whereas healthy guilt actually highlights something specific with which we can change. And so we'll talk about that and how shame keeps us spiraled in these broken patterns of relationship with self and others.
Wow, I can hardly wait to get to that. That sounds like a good one. I almost want to fast forward to that place already, but we'll have to be patient and wait. But I think that's something that a lot of us really struggle with. I see it. I think even as children, there's the immediate, if I've stepped out of my values in a situation that suddenly is me, I'm a bad person, or I'm, that sort of language. And I think we're all tempted towards that. So I think being able to distinguish between those two things would be incredibly helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Then, of course, the story highlights the relational tensions. And I sometimes think we miss almost the comedy at work in the Adam and Eve story, that, so when they're found out, when they're exposed, their mistake has been made plain, the very first thing that happens is a blame game. Adam, what have you done? Well, it was her. Eve, what have you done? Well, it was the snake, right? A propensity we have as humans to, and this is where it gets tricky, because sometimes outside influences and others really do have an impact on us, but maybe our propensity to very quickly dismiss our own actions and place it on other people, the blame game. Yeah. And how to sort of work between, okay, what do I need to own here? And what is actually legitimately someone else's actions to own? Yeah.
And if the belief is shame, so when someone realizes they've stepped out of their values or did something wrong, I'm using air quotes here, one of the first emotions to show up is shame. You know, you talked about an example of a child saying, I did something bad or I'm bad. That's the shame voice, which we all want to run away from, the same way Adam and Eve did. And then to run away from it, we use those 3 barriers to accountability that I spoke of in a previous episode, and we'll go a bit deeper: minimize, deny, and blame. And there's a real highlight on the blame game, as you said, where Adam's like, hey, it's the woman. It was the snake. He also blamed God. The woman you gave me.
I missed that. That is interesting.
Is like, you gave me this person. Like, wow. He is like running feverishly away from this sense of shame in which he knows he stepped outside of the values that were clearly defined for him.
Oh, wow. This is so profitable. You know, I've never noticed that, Grace, until now. That is fantastic. And it's that sort of stuff that I want to get into later on in the year as well. I've found myself concerned lately about people in long-term relationships, whether that's marriage, common law, whatever. I've been thinking lately, what effect has the pandemic had on us? And, you know, I sense with people I'm working with that relationships are strained today. And I'm sure you see a whole lot of that. But yeah, I wonder, and it's made me think, you know, we're going to go into a series later on this year that I'm excited, but also sort of have some fear about, talking about, you know, marriage, relationships, lust, friendship, intimacy, like really want to dive into relational stuff later this year. And I was, of course, at our mutual friend Riley's wedding this past weekend, and I was charged with the homily, and I gave this as this is again a Harrison Scott Key quote, because this book just made me laugh so much. But I love this line. He says this: I've prayed for my wife more than just about anyone else because God says to pray for your enemies. And marriage can sometimes be a war of attrition and one of siege, sometimes cold, occasionally hot. And it made me laugh because there are, you know, we want, of course, our relationships to be healthy, but the moment that we're in them, we realize that there's often wills and egos and different interests and expectations. And so there's always these tensions involved in relationships. And I'd really like to get underneath that. Hopefully, now I've heard this, Grace, correct me if I'm wrong. I once heard from someone that the 3 biggest relational sort of stressors and tensions tend to be sex, in-laws, and money. I'm not sure if that's a complete picture, but I know in my experience, those tend to be an area of tension, or can be. So, yeah.
Absolutely. You know, there are definitely more external factors that can put pressure on relationship. I'm reminded of a quote by Daniel Goleman. He writes about emotional intelligence. And he says, whenever there is internal conflict, it will lead to external conflict. If there's something going on inside of you and you don't address it, it's gonna spill out. And, you know, when I work with couples, especially on some of those primary stressors you talked about, finances, sex, it's a lot about what's going on inside the person, belief systems they're operating under, which aren't actually useful to themselves nor the partnership. And we do a lot of unpacking to bring subconscious thoughts and beliefs to the surface. Beliefs are like an app. Like, they run in the background, but they're absolutely influencing the things that you're thinking, doing, and how you're experiencing the world. And so whether it's shame, misplaced guilt, healthy guilt, there's a lot going on inside of us, but taking space to unpack and explore in a healthy way is largely what helps relationships thrive.
Yeah, and I think what you just highlighted there as well is how integrated these three areas are. Our tensions with ourselves affect how we perceive God, our relationships. Like there's so many ways that these three areas are intertwined. And so addressing one could have ramifications. It could have, an impact on others. And so that's the sort of hope this coming season, this year, is as we delve into some of these, maybe it impacts other areas. But I think you've done a brilliant job of highlighting how these tensions can, start with one thing, but manifest in our relationships and our spirituality. So
absolutely.
Yeah, that's
Thank
exciting.
you, Brad. And I believe you have too. And I'm excited for us to journey together. One of the things I often tell my new clients as they start to come to me with their concerns, and usually there are multiple concerns, I said, consider therapy like a plate of spaghetti. Mm-hmm. You pull one noodle and others are going to come with it. And that's what I see us talking about in this series, Brad. The tensions between us and God, us and ourselves, and relationships. They're all connected. Mm-hmm. They're all connected. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is where we're headed. I can't wait to dive in next week. As I said, for the next 4 weeks, we'll be talking more specifically about our tensions with God before we move on to some other things. But as I've already learned this morning, I have a feeling it's not just going to be just a purely theological discussion. I have a feeling we'll be all over the place. So that should be fun.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it, Brad.
Wonderful. Thanks, Grace. Have a great day.
You too. Bye now.